Right, so I'm going to use this video as a kind of an introduction to synaptic plasticity. I actually made 2 videos last year detailing both the Aplysia californica story and the long-term potentiation story and the mouse hippocampus that I think are still good. Some of the old videos I'm throwing out because I explain things poorly, but I think those ones are pretty solid. I want to use this as just a way to kind of introduce the idea of plasticity, because I think that's something I haven't done very well in the past, in past years I've TA'd for this class. Plasticity is a humongously important, very broad and essential concept for neuroscience, and it's kind of a tragedy that we don't get to talk about it more. There's classes in graduate school that have entire units on just this one little 15-minute video I'm going to give you here. So, I mean, this concept is not small potatoes in any sense of the word. There's a lot of ways people like to talk about synaptic plasticity, and it has become pretty sensationalized in popular culture. A lot of times you'll hear people trying to sell you things that boost your plasticity or they boost your whatever. Please don't ever buy these. They're like $60 for a tiny little bottle of brain power boosters that usually has absolutely nothing to do with brain function. In fact, they did a study a long time ago that said that most brain supplements don't actually cross the blood-brain barrier, which I think is pretty funny. So yeah, plasticity is often kind of used as a buzzword, especially in the more spiritual realm of neuroscience. Like, you can boost your plasticity by meditating, or you can boost your plasticity by blankety blank blank. I have nothing against meditation. I think it is important. But what do we need to define plasticity. Before we talk about it, what do we mean by plasticity? Plasticity equals the ability to change. And that's a really broad definition because it can apply to many different realms of neuroscience. What we're talking about in this class is synaptic plasticity, and I'll go into that in a little more detail in a sec, but plasticity is not unique to synapses. We can define a behavioral plasticity in which your behaviors change as a function of different stimuli. We can talk about, a lot of times, neuroplasticity, which is usually referencing the fact that your brain will reorganize in response to a lost sensory system or something like that. But overall, plasticity just refers to the fact that your brain is somehow changing. In the scope of this course, what we mean when we say plasticity is actually synaptic plasticity. So what are the different ways I could change a synapse? There's 2 overarching categories through which all these other words fit, and I think it's kind of ridiculous how many different words are used to talk about synaptic plasticity. So I'm going to try to categorize them for you just so you can get a sense of where those words fit in. Facilitation, I think, is the most important of the increased activity words I need you to know. And what this means is that you are increasing synaptic strength as a function of changes in the synapse. That's a redundant way to say that. You're increasing synaptic strength as a function of activity. Depression, when we're talking about synapses, when we say depression, we mean you are decreasing synaptic strength as a function of activity. Real quick, I'm going to try to think of all the different words I know that relate to one of these concepts. So facilitation, oftentimes you'll hear people say sensitization. or potentiation. Depression, a lot of times you'll hear habituation. Let's see, what's another one? Desensitization. So what do I mean when I say some synaptic strength? I guess what I mean is that the effect of activity in the presynaptic, if you facilitate the synapse, you're creating a greater effect on the postsynaptic neuron. So let's say I have my presynaptic neuron here, and here's my postsynaptic neuron. Let's say I fire an action potential, and then the postsynaptic neuron fires an action potential. Now let's say I keep doing this, and over time, the strength of this action potential or the frequency gets a lot bigger. I guess action potentials, again, are all or nothing. So let's say that I fire an action potential in the presynaptic. Say it's 4 action potentials per second, and then in the postsynaptic, it starts out as 4 action potentials per second, but then over time, as I keep doing this, it becomes more and more and more, and all of a sudden it's firing really strongly. That's what I mean by facilitation. You're increasing the strength of the synapse, meaning you're increasing the response of the postsynaptic neuron to presynaptic input. And then depression is just the opposite, right? So you're decreasing the output of a synapse in response to the same input. So when we talk about our two different stories of synaptic plasticity, aplesia californica and the mouse hippocampus, we're defining two different types of plasticity, one being short-term and one being long-term. And again, there's short-term and long-term effects on both of these systems. But short-term plasticity I'm going to say arises as a function of local transient meaning temporary, changes to the synapse itself. And this can be facilitation, it can be depression, it can be any subset of those. And there are reasons to define facilitation as sensitization or potentiation. They're just a lot more specific. Whereas long-term plasticity I'm going to say this arises as a function of genetic changes or structure, or I'm going to say genetic or structural changes. So this is what happens when you start producing more of a certain receptor, or you start leading to the exocytosis of vesicles that have a certain receptor, or things like that. So I can give you a couple examples. I mean, if I was to stimulate the crap out of a neuron, right, I just stimulate it like crazy, eventually it's going to release all of its synaptic vesicles, right? It's going to release all of those vesicles in its readily releasable pool. So the effect on the postsynaptic neuron is going to pretty quickly dwindle, right? Because once you run out of synaptic vesicles and you're not making them fast enough to replenish them, you're not going to be releasing as much neurotransmitter, and the effect in the postsynaptic is going to decrease. So there's a good figure for this in his slides, but it's essentially just, here's my activity. I'm just stimulating the crap out of this neuron, right? So this is the activity in the presynaptic. And then if we measure like the excitatory postsynaptic currents or I guess let's say the excitatory postsynaptic potential in the postsynaptic, it's pretty standard for a while, but then you start to deplete the presynaptic of those vesicles, and all of a sudden you lost your response in the postsynaptic. This is an example, I totally messed that up, I should have drawn it down here, because this is an example of short-term synaptic depression. And what I mean by that is that this occurs because it's arising as a function of these local changes to your local transient changes to the synapse itself. If you were to give this neuron a couple minutes, let it get a breather and drink some water, it would eventually reestablish its normal response to this stimulus. If, however, you were to do this so extensively that some kind of gene transcriptional change eventually led to eventually led to decrease in synaptic vesicle production overall, that would be a long-term plasticity change, right? So when we talk about, I guess I'll give you more specific examples. When we talk about aplesia californica, what's happening is that we're facilitating the presynaptic release of neurotransmitters. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the next video, but essentially what's happening is that in response to a tail shock from one neuron, you're releasing serotonin onto another neuron's terminal. So here's a synaptic terminal, here's serotonin being released. The overall effect of that serotonin release is to activate a metabotropic G-alpha-esque coupled pathway that's going to lead to the phosphorylation. I'm skipping a lot of steps here. And I drew this as a channel, but it's not a channel. It's a 7 transmembrane protein. It's going to lead to the phosphorylation of an L-type calcium channel, which is going to increase calcium release. So I can say that the overall effect of serotonin on this metabotropic serotonin receptor is going to be to increase calcium in the presynaptic. You can think of this as a type of short-term synaptic facilitation, right? Because what you're doing is you're increasing the amount of neurotransmitter that's being released, thereby in the short term increasing the response of the postsynaptic neuron accordingly, right? Because if you're releasing more neurotransmitter from the presynaptic, you're going to get a stronger response in the postsynaptic. In terms of some kind of long-term change, that's what we see in the hippocampal story. And that's where we get back into that idea of what AMPA and NMDA do when they work together. AMPA and NMDA, I guess I should say NMDA activity in response to an increase in AMPA activity is going to lead to calcium influx, and the effect of calcium influx is going to be pretty broad. I mean, remember we talked about the fact that calcium couples activity to molecular regulation of cell function. So this is going to actually lead to a structural change in the postsynaptic neuron on the mouse hippocampus story, in which your postsynaptic neuron is actually incorporating more AMPA receptors into its membrane. So it's going to, in a long-term way, sensitize or potentiate the response of glutamate to, or the response of your postsynaptic neuron to glutamate. So that's a long-term type of facilitation, or in the case of mice hippocampal slices, oftentimes we call it long-term potentiation. Because in the long term, you're increasing the probability or the potential that glutamate is going to activate the postsynaptic neuron. And that's essentially getting pretty deep into what we consider learning, right? Learning as a function of synaptic strength is going to be if you perceive or if you receive a stimulus via your sensory systems and it leads to a stronger response of your central nervous system, that means in some kind of roundabout way that you have learned about that stimulus. So that'll become a little bit more applied once we talk about the two stories, the Aplesia californica and the mouse hippocampus.